Greetings and welcome to Ghost Stories of Washington, Chapter 1, Haunted Houses. For most of us, our home is the single most important. Get out of the way. It's not time yet. For most of us, our home is the single most important place in the world. No matter whether we live in a mansion or a hotel, it's home. Our ultimate shelter from the rigors of the world. Nowhere else do we find such security and comfort. Moreover, we often share our homes with those we love most. Perhaps then we shouldn't be too surprised that such an intimate, emotionally charged area is frequently the site of paranormal activity. The emotional energy we exude becomes embedded in the psychic landscape surrounding us. If, in his lifetime, your father sat in a particular chair reading his newspaper every evening, you might, after his death, still think that you see him there occasionally. Such a sighting really begs a question. Does the image reside solely in the imagination of the one perceiving it? Or is a remnant of the dead man's spirit still enjoying the sports pages? The following stories suggest that not all of the ethereal images in our homes are merely wishful memories. Some people truly do share their homes with ghosts. Our first story is entitled World Famous Washington Story. Washington State has been home to some landmark hauntings. One of the strangest has to be the case of the haunted home of the Smith family. No relation to me, of course. Although this ghost story did not become public knowledge until the mid-1970s, terrifying events had already been taking place in the Seattle home for more than 10 years by that time. When Doris Smith bought the bungalow in 1962 as a home for herself and her two teenage children, the former owners gave her no indication that there was anything out of the ordinary about the little house. The first hint that paranormal forces were at work came during the week between Christmas and New Year's Eve in 1962. Doris heard noises and scraping of furniture. The woman's first thought was that an intruder had somehow broken into the house. Somewhere hesitantly, she checked all the rooms and found no one else present. Doris knew what she'd heard and knew that she was not the type who was given to flights of fantasy. But she would never have guessed at the time that she had purchased an extremely haunted piece of real estate and was about to go up against the challenge of her life. From then on, according to psychic investigator Bart Ellis, the noises began to occur more regularly. Worse, the phantom sounds were often accompanied by unpleasant odors and malfunctions in electrical equipment. Understandably concerned about her family's safety, Doris Smith began to ask her neighbors if they'd noticed anything strange in the area. Everyone she questioned reported that there was nothing at all unusual about the area, with the exception of the house that Doris had just purchased. The frightening events in that house, they told her, were the reason that the previous family had decided to move. As Mrs. Smith struggled to comprehend her situation, the telltale signs of the haunting increased, and it was not just members of the Smith family who bore witness to the phantom activity. Anyone who happened to be in the house heard inexplicable screams, footsteps, disembodied voices, some of which were singing, others that were talking, and other unidentified strange noises. No matter where in the house a person happened to be, the sound seemed to be coming from another location. If people were in the basement, they would hear ghostly voices from the living room. If people went up to the living room, those same sounds would now seem to be coming from the basement. The sounds of the haunting continued to be elusive, but before long the sights were not. Doris Smith, her children, and everyone else who happened to be in the house would stare in amazement as the doors to kitchen cupboards opened and closed, apparently of their own accord. Water gushed from faucets when no one had even been near the tap. The family bravely tried to carry on with life as best they could, but when Doris began to see apparitions, she became extremely concerned. She described shadows appearing on walls at a time and place when no shadow should have been possible. She and her family stood in amazement as a smoke-shaped form materialized in the entrance to one room. On different occasions, glowing red lights and a shaft of light manifested in the basement. Offensive odors would suddenly hang in the air, and then, just as quickly, all traces would be gone. In a hopeful attempt to find a natural cause and remedy for the strange goings on, Doris Smith called in representatives of every conceivable trade. Much to her disappointment, none of the carpenters, plumbers, or electricians she contacted could offer any physical explanation for the things that she was hearing, seeing, and smelling. In desperation, Doris Smith finally called in physics. These people did have some answers for her, although it's doubtful that theirs were the answers she wanted. Margaret, the first psychic to tour the house, was immediately drawn to the living room. But as soon as she got there, she stopped dead in her tracks. Clutching her chest, the sensitive declared, "There is so much sadness in the house that it hurts my chest." At least the Smiths now knew they had not been imagining all of the bizarre things that had been happening in their home. Margaret then put herself into a trance state and entered the basement bedroom used by Doris's son. Just seconds after she lay down on the teenager's bed, Margaret began to speak. Margaret told Doris, "The ghost who lives here is an Indian named Douglas. He lives at the house with his mother, whose name is Dove. Douglas is at the house to protect the bones of his ancestors, which are on the grounds. The ancestors were apparently killed by Oregon fur traders." This information probably did not do much to comfort any of the Smiths, because it implied that the hunting was a long-term situation and the ghosts were enduring. Margaret's next inferences, though, must have relieved Doris Smith's mind. Speaking in the peculiar fashion of someone in a trance state, the psychic added that Douglas was also protecting another woman in the house, one who was part Indian. Margaret had no prior knowledge of anyone living in the house, so she could not have known that Doris's heritage included Native American people. Doris took Margaret's words to mean that the spirit was also watching over her well-being. Margaret spoke to Douglas directly, trying to assure him that the Smiths were looking after the house and the land on which it stood. She encouraged Douglas to leave his post as guard and go on to his final reward. Still in an altered state of consciousness, Margaret and those accompanying her left the house and began to walk around the yard. After just a few moments, the psychic stopped and announced that human remains, most likely those from the massacre that Douglas's spirit had described, were buried just below her feet. She declared the vibrations to be very strong. In two particular places, it was below those spots she concluded that the skeletons lay. Less than a month after Margaret's visit, Doris Smith arranged to have another psychic, a man named Paul, come to the house. She took care to ensure that the man knew nothing about her or the house. She did not tell him of Margaret's recent findings or even the other psychic's visit to the haunted house. Despite this secrecy, Paul went directly to the two places in the yard that Margaret had identified as being full of energy. He felt equally strong vibrations in those areas. Being a pragmatic sort, Doris began to investigate the local history so she could verify the things that the psychics had told her. According to sources at the Seattle Public Library, there had been a terrible battle on the approximate site where her house stood during the 1850s. Native American people camped in the area. History not only records the battles between the two tribes, but also between the natives and the fur traders. Clearly, many lives had been lost on the land that Doris Smith now owned. Small wonder that her house was home to spirits as well as to the living. By this time, word about the eerie events in the Seattle house had spread. Bart Ellis, a psychic investigator from Los Angeles, made arrangements to visit the Smiths and their noisy, uninvited phantom house guests. Armed with an ordinary portable tape recorder, Ellis visited the house many times between August 8th and the 22nd. In 1970, he came away with recordings that to this day shock anyone who listens to them, including me. Ellis set the machine to the record setting, ensured that no one stayed behind in the basement, and then left. A constant roar of static and sounds of people laughing, screaming, speaking are clearly audible, as are the sounds of footfalls and doors opening and closing. Interestingly, while Ellis was in the basement setting up his equipment, he could not hear any noises at all. On the last night at the haunted house, Ellis, with the support of Doris Smith, invited a party of interested people, including a scientist, a journalist, and a graduate student from the University of Washington to join him in recording the ghostly sounds. A total of 14 tape recorders were set up and left to run, while all involved sat upstairs together, never leaving the living room. All 14 recorders captured the same inexplicable sounds. Later in the evening, the group, which also included a friend of Doris's, gathered in the basement room where their tape machines had been set up. Once assembled, they all heard the unmistakable sounds of someone walking on the floor above them, even though all of the living beings in the house were together on the lower level. The graduate student offered to pace out the route of footsteps had taken while the others listened. He walked across the living room to the kitchen and then down the basement stairs. Those gathered then broke into two smaller groups, one staying downstairs and one up. The people upstairs could, of course, hear as well as see the student walking, but his single set of footfalls was all that they heard. The group in the basement heard two distinct sets of footsteps, the students and the ghosts. At this point in their exhausting day, Doris and her visiting friends were understandably tired. The researchers left, and the two women sat quietly in a basement room, trying to absorb all that they had experienced over the last few hours. As they did, a milky white, cloudy, opaque light shaft suddenly appeared, seeming to originate near the ceiling. It shone down and then moved along the floor, changing from a shaft to a circle of light. The circle appeared to be made up of many smaller circles of equally bright light. Terrified, Doris Smith's friend grabbed for a flashlight and aimed at the presence, which then vanished before their eyes. Once back in California, Bart Ellis took his tapes to be checked out by the Sony Corporation. Although the technicians could also hear the human voices, they were at a loss to explain them. Next, he played the sounds for an anthropological linguist who declared that the voices were not speaking in either a Germanic or Romance language, but in that it was probably a North American Aboriginal language. Although the Smiths had tried to adapt, it was difficult to function normally in a haunted house inhabited by spirits that were apparently gaining strength. Manifestations of pulsating, transparent white human-sized forms began appearing in different rooms of the house. A family friend captured the image of one of those supernatural presences with her camera. Once developed, the photograph clearly revealed a misty formation. Even recreational activities were difficult in the house. When Mrs. Smith's son and friends would try to play a game of pool in the basement game room, the cue ball would often move suddenly and mysteriously. Eventually, the family gave up trying to play pool. But the boys' bedroom, which adjoined the game room, was sometimes filled with the distinct sound of pool balls being hit by cues in the middle of the night. Whatever was in this house clearly did not want the living to play pool, yet it wanted to enjoy a game for itself. Because nothing has been heard about this haunted house for many years now, it is reasonable to assume that the dead and the living eventually found mutually satisfying accommodations. Hopefully you enjoyed that story, and I look forward in the coming months to bringing you ghost stories of Washington. Take care and have a great night. And be careful. You never know. Your house might be haunted. Watch out. You might see ghosts unaware. Spooky. Spooky, spooky, spooky.